It is now 10 past the hour, and I'd like to welcome you to Applied AI Lunch Talks today. In this instantiation of it, we're going to hear from Henrik Cullen from Corti. Generally, AI Lunch Talk is about sharing knowledge about applied AI. It's about getting together people from academia, people from industry, being small and medium-sized enterprises, could also be big enterprises. So today we're going to hear from a scale-up, and Henrik has been the VP of development for 5 years at Corti. And I think without further ado, I'd like to bring you on stage. For those of you joining us online, I should say you can write your questions in the chat online, and we'll ask them after the talk. Today we only have one speaker at the talk, so we should be done around a quarter, maybe 10 minutes to 1. Good.
Hello. There we go. I have audio. Good to see you. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Corti, a little bit about myself, a little bit about the problem we're trying to solve, and also how we do it. So firstly,
we're trying to get something on the screen.
It's just the logo for now, so I can tell you a little bit about what Corti does. We are a company we started about 7 years ago, based in Denmark, but we're now all across Europe and the US. And was it just not plugged in? Oh, yeah. Use error. And I joined about 5 years ago when we were about 15 people. We're now about 110 people. And so we are doing machine learning in the healthcare space, or for the investors out there, it is AI health tech SaaS. And in essence, perfect. There we go. And we've been working with different sort of organizations in healthcare, from hospital systems across Europe, emergency departments in Copenhagen, Sweden, in the US, and nurse advice lines and similar. So I'll tell you a little bit about that, but I think that gives you enough of an introduction of what Corti does before I get into some tangible things. Quick introduction of me. I'm the VP of product at Corti, leading the product team for about 4 years. My background before this is I went to CBS, so I have a business background, but went into sort of technology companies, ended up trying to found my own company, shut down my own company, and then joined Corti, where I've been leading product there. So what I do, I started as a product manager, so my role is sort of the intersect between business, end user usability design, sort of, and of course technology. And then there's lots of other responsibilities. I still end up doing marketing. We might be 100 and something people, but you still wear many hats in a startup. And I lead sort of 6 other product managers and designers, and then we have a team of about 45 engineers based mostly in Europe, but a few also in the United States. But I spend a lot of my time with customers, so management people at hospitals, for example, but also end users, so nurses, doctors, emergency call takers. And it sounds kind of sad, but I do spend a lot of time thinking about patient workflows. And I'm trying to think of sort of a universal model for how we can think about patient workflows. And one of the ways I kind of look at it is there's a patient encounter. So there's when you go to your GP, you have a conversation with them, they ask you some questions, you answer those questions. There's a dialogue. Then there's a decision that's made. It could be, the doctor gives you a prescription, you go and pick it up, and then afterwards they document what happened, and it goes into your patient journal. But I think this is quite a universal model for patient workflows at a sort of a micro level, because if you go into telemedicine, it's basically the same thing. It just happens to be on a smartphone, and the documentation might be a little bit different, but in essence, it's the same. in the emergency space. So if you call up 112 in Denmark, if you call up 911, again, it's the same thing. You speak to someone, there's a conversation. You might not be the patient calling in. You're calling in sometimes on behalf of a patient. But there is the majority of the information that's conveyed in this is in spoken word. Questions are asked, and if they're good questions, they get good answers. And if you have good answers, you reach a decision. In the case of an emergency, it's sending an ambulance, sending a helicopter, giving out CPR instructions, those sorts of things. And again, good answers lead to better decisions. And then, of course, there's still documentation. There still needs to be a report at the end of it. And then the final one, this is for us also a new space that we're entering as well, is actually health insurance space as well. So health insurance, if you call up your provider, if you have private insurance, you'll typically speak to a clinician, maybe a nurse. They will ask you questions about your symptoms. They will then make a decision of should you have some sort of referral to physiotherapy or whatever. And of course, there's documentation. So the average doctor does about 150,000, sees 150,000 patients in their career. It's the equivalent of 700 jumbo jets in their entire career of people. It's a weird comparison, but people typically compare to like the size of Wales or how many people you can fit in a jumbo jet. So there you go. But what's more depressing of this is that 35% of that time is spent documenting. It is writing notes, it's filling in forms, and I don't know how many of you know doctors or nurses or anyone in the sort of clinical space, and you probably hear how much they hate this part. There's probably a few that love it. I haven't met them, but I'm sure they exist. But this translates into multiple hours per day. 2.5 typically is the average if you speak to a GP. And what they're actually ending up doing is that, so the average time for a GP, I'll use this as an example, but it sort of extends to a lot of different spaces. The average time they have per patient is around 15 minutes. And so they spend maybe 10, 11 minutes with the patient, and then they spend 7 minutes writing documentation. So I'm sure you can do the maths. It's not adding up. They have 15 minutes to do it, and they have an 18-minute long task. So they're spending time at the end of the day doing documentation, and then they have a workload of maybe 10 of their patients that they haven't done documentation for, and they're casting their mind back to, sure, it wasn't that long ago in number of hours, but in number of patients, 10 patients ago, could they really remember everything that happened in the consultation? The answer is no. So there was a report, I've references, I can also send you a link afterwards. 60% of patient records, so that is, say, the review, the documentation written by a doctor after a consultation had fairly major inaccuracies. It could be a symptom that was like an important symptom that was missed from the documentation, or surprisingly quite often it could be a symptom that was added to the documentation was actually never mentioned. Or sometimes they're those things that are a little bit harder to judge, and it's actually not covered in this study, but where it's slightly misrepresentation of what the patient meant. And that then leads to the other interesting research is that then, according to Mayo Clinic, 88% of diagnoses are what they class as inadequate. And further to that, 21% are actually critically incorrect. So there is something critically wrong with the diagnosis given by a doctor. So the easy sort of answer to this is, doctors aren't doing their job. Nurses don't know what they're doing. Their training's bad or something. But it obviously that's not true, right? I'm very lucky. If I lose a bit of concentration at work, I lose maybe 20 minutes of productivity, right? If a doctor, loses concentration, starts thinking about what they're going to make for dinner that night, they lose valuable information that is meant to go into a patient record, right? And that has an effect on the patient's care later down the line. And of course, on their diagnosis. The other big issue is that there is a major lack of clinicians. That is, anyone really in the healthcare space, that is nurses, that is doctors, that is those working to support the entire space. I'm from the UK. It's a little bit less bad here, but the situation in the UK is really, really bad, such that because there aren't enough staff to deal with the patients in the hospitals, ambulances arriving at a hospital with a patient at the start of their shift. It's the first patient they picked up, and they wait there outside for 12 hours. Their entire shift for these ambulance drivers is sitting outside the hospital with a single patient because the hospital doesn't have resources to take in the patients. And so a couple of reasons for this. Of course, we have an aging population. You hear about this all the time. We have a greater expectation of what healthcare should be and more need for healthcare. And there are also doctors and nurses that are leaving the profession because of stress. There's so many different causes that leave us in this situation where, from the World Medical Association, we're missing 18 million medics in 2035. And actually, I think this is a bit of an old statistic, so this is pre-COVID. So COVID has only made this situation worse. And then the other thing that I find really, really peculiar, so I speak with God knows how many people in the healthcare space, and about quality, and of course it's really important that we have the highest quality. This number, there's no reference. I'm not entirely sure if there is really a number here. So don't look too much into the actual data, but it's more representing the fact that the vast majority of medical consultations are not really reviewed for quality. So in the emergency services space, you call up 112, your call will be recorded, and across most of sort of the West, for example, and in the US, you'll expect that 2 to 3% of calls will be recorded for quality, be assessed for quality. But you go to your doctor. Have they ever had one of their consultations recorded, listened to, and reviewed by someone else? Has there ever been analysis of all the calls for or all the consultations at a hospital? I find it really, really strange that call centers that sell you insurance or try and sign you up to something have much better analytics about what their call takers are doing than those that are dealing with your health. So, I think it's sort of time that there was a bit more science, a bit more research into one of the oldest tools in medicine, which is the medical interview. That's where Corti comes in. So what is Corti? We are Corti. These people, 100 or so people. This is a photograph taken from when we were in Italy in September. We had a company retreat there, so almost everyone from the company came. This is engineers, salespeople, everyone. But what we actually do is we help make better decisions faster. And what that means is not just better decisions during a consultation. Do we help the doctor make the right decision about what's right in the documentation, or help the emergency call taker to send the right ambulance? It's also about the right decisions at a system level. Should we hire more nurses, or can we actually optimize the questions they ask so actually they're spending less time on the call? Can we analyze what questions they're asking to find the ones that are leading to the most inaccurate decisions? Can we use data to train our staff so that we get better decisions in the future? Our current process right now for continuous quality improvement is training seminars every 6 to 8 months, right? Corti is helping this by having a continuous quality improvement workflow for healthcare. So how it works, we take all of the unstructured data of a consultation. It could be the audio recording from a telephone call or an in-person consultation. We take the clinical notes that may be written by a doctor or again, unstructured data. And we also take triaging data. So typically form like structured, semi-structured data from forms and so on. It could be a chatbot that a patient's filled in advance. It could be some data from health records. It's also data from one of our internal systems as well that I can show you. And we process it to create what I kind of like to describe as a real-time, somewhat objective at least, structured representation of a consultation. So as the consultation is going, as we're analyzing the audio stream in real time or any of the artifacts of that consultation in real time, we're generating this document. That document, of course, includes a transcript. So what is actually said? It's interesting, it's important, but it's not that exciting. But we can also extract the patient details that are mentioned there. We can extract the symptoms that are mentioned there. The diagnoses that are implied in the doctor's clinical notes. We can bring up live alerts for the clinician, maybe reminding them that this is a good example for someone calls up 911. Maybe you want to recommend that the patient actually doesn't call 911, but is referred to a nurse advice line. So in Denmark, if you call up 112 and it's not an emergency, they'll probably redirect you to 1813, which is the equivalent nurse advice line. So reminding those call takers that there are alternative options. We, of course, have the codes. So every single medical consultation needs to be coded for billing purposes, for reporting purposes, and so on. And we can also analyze, from a more of a service perspective, is it good service? Is the doctor or is the clinician speaking to the patient in a way that they can easily be understood, that they're providing a good patient experience? And we can detect all of these things in real time and then help prompt the clinician so that we can actually drive improvements for the patient and for the system. So what it leads to is, of course, better patient interactions, faster, cheaper, better decisions, and so on. It also leads to less admin work. If we can automate the documentation, that's one of the other things I had there, documentation. They're spending less time on writing notes after the fact. And of course, as I mentioned, for continuous quality analysis and for continuous quality improvement. So looking at a hospital or a healthcare system at a system level and using all of this data from every single consultation. So that structured representation of a consultation and analyzing it to improve every future consultation. So very, very concretely, what our product does and how we integrate ourselves into our customers is, one, we have a call recording system. So we integrate into, if you go into 112 in Copenhagen, they've got their offices in Ballerup. We're plugged into their telephone system, and we record every single call. If you go to nurse advice line in north of Dallas in Texas, there's nurses there. Every single one of their calls is being recorded by our system, and that's cool. But what we do on top of that is we then analyze that. And it pairs with then yes, we got a question. Let's take that straight away.
What about 1813?
Not yet. They're coming soon. But yep. So we work with 112 at the moment, and we're rolling out slowly with 1813. It's actually an important point to note from a business perspective is that one of the reasons we're focusing more in the United States is that public healthcare systems are slow. There's a lot of procurement processes and finding the right funds and so on. So the US healthcare system, for all its faults, at least is quite fast moving when it comes to a technology like ours and rolling that out. Triaging support. So this is a platform that is used by clinicians, so nurses, emergency call takers, in every single one of their consultations. And there's no AI in this part of the product. There's no AI in the call recording either. It's just, we record audio, and then this is a fancy Google Forms. It's a little bit more complex than that. But in essence, it shows what is the next question that the call taker should ask, and then given what they click, what's the next thing that they see, right? But these two things are really, really core to our product, because then they allow us to also overlay those suggestions. So in this case, I gave the example earlier, we think you should refer the patient to a nurse advice line, or here's a referral that we think is most appropriate for this patient. And what's happened here is that the AI, the machine learning, has listened into that audio, and it's come up with its own decision or its own suggestion for what the nurse should do. And then after the fact, of course, we automatically document that consultation, finding the appropriate structure for that specialty. So using a format called SBAR, so for nursing, which is quite common, which is sort of breaking up into, as if it were written by a human, the situation of the patient, the background, the assessment, and the recommendation made. This is entirely automated to the point where nurses in Dallas are used to spend about 7 minutes documenting a call, are spending about 30, 40 seconds now, thanks to our technology. And then, of course, the analytics, looking for training opportunities and system improvement opportunities. So I mentioned this organization in Dallas. They came to us back last year, mid last year, and they said, we have these 40 nurses, and we intend to double the size of our nurse advice line in the next 18 months. But nurses are really, really hard to hire. Again, we saw earlier, there's a lack of clinicians. That includes nurses. And particularly in this area, there are none, and we need them co-located. So how can we make better use of our existing nurses? How can we optimize their time so they are not, so we don't need to hire as many? And so we came to them and we said, sure, we can do this. We've done this before. So we implemented our product. It was, we implemented the triaging tool. Again, point and click and select what you want to do. And we automated their documentation, and we gave them analytics as to how their system was working and where it wasn't working. And so we went live in January, and what we've actually seen is two things, and I think they're both very interesting. So the first thing is that call time has actually slightly increased. So our system, immediately like, oh, gotcha, it failed, right? You've increased call time. But then the other thing we've done is we've reduced then the time of documentation after the fact. But the first part is really interesting because the fact that we've increased call time seems like a bad thing initially, but it's actually really important. Because what we've done instead is we've standardized their system. What used to be nurses that would sort of ask random questions based on their backgrounds, their experience, what they thought was important. We now have created a structured workflow of questions that they are sort of highly encouraged, at least, to ask, right? We've enforced a process that ensures that standardization across patients, across consultations, across incidents. And it means that it's reproducible, which is important, so that it's not lottery which nurse you get that takes your call. But it also means that when you improve, when you change the underlying process, you change the questions that people meant to ask, for example, the entire, all nurses follow that new process. So everyone almost immediately benefits from the new process. So we've done the hard work of getting them to be standardized. Now it's about finding those optimizations, and we're already doing that, to reduce call time, to optimize call time, and to improve the efficacy of of the system. So the other thing that they needed, I have it on there, is of course they wanted to make sure that they were more compliant with their calls, right? They had a big concern that their nurses were just asking questions that were not as important and maybe missing critical symptoms. So with this nurse advice line, it's actually a little bit different from many nurse advice lines in the United States. It's ones where people have called 911 first and have then been referred to this nurse advice line. And the reason that's different is that patients, if you call 911, you think you're in a critical situation. So these patients are a little bit more stressed, and therefore they might also have some critical symptoms. They might actually have chest pain that is a precursor to a heart attack, right? So those critical questions that the nurse asks, if they're missed, could actually lead to a patient getting into a bad situation, ultimately potentially dying. The other example we have is an organization called Ramsay Santé. It's the second largest private healthcare system in Europe, and they have their Danish part of it is called Capio, and it's the second largest hospital system in Denmark. They had a similar problem. One, our doctors and medical secretaries are spending way too much time on admin work. So Corti help us reduce that by about 50%. And two, we have a problem with documentation quality as well. It's not critical. It wasn't sort of an existential threat to them yet, but they had concerns about were they fully compliant? If there was review, would they suddenly have problems with? I guess it's Sundhedsstyrelsen in Denmark that does that. That audits your documentation, ensures that you're compliant, and they wanted to make sure that their documentation was always improving and was always at the top of what they could deliver. So again, we came to them with. Well, first we spent a lot of time understanding their workflows, understanding how their organization worked, and then we developed an application for them that is just a workflow tool. And in that workflow tool, we inject our machine learning, which is, in this case, it's focused on supporting with documentation and automatically coding, so identifying the procedure and the diagnosis codes, automatically doing that in that workflow. And then again, we give them the insights across their entire organization to improve. What they found is there's one of their doctors. Our machine learning wasn't working very well. It seemed that we weren't able to identify diagnoses as in this case, the input was the clinical note that the doctor had written or had dictated, and we weren't able to find the appropriate diagnosis. And we're like, oh shit, our model's broken. No. What we actually found is that one particular doctor was not being specific enough in his documentation about what the actual diagnosis was. So we actually found that there was a compliance issue that could quite easily be fixed. Of course, the documentation has to say what the diagnosis was. You can't just have it in the code. So again, this is an example where it's not just about the automation, but it's about the overall system improvement. So how do we work from a machine learning perspective? You're all quite technical, I imagine. We have sort of a couple different approaches. You've all heard about GPT-4, the magic that LLMs are wreaking on the earth, and I love it. I think these technologies are amazing, right? So we've actually been experimenting with using some of these tools in our product as well. So we see us as being both at the very, very top, working with universities, with researchers. We have our own research arm that focuses on machine learning and coming up with like new methodologies for speech recognition as well. That's sort of one of our prime sort of machine learning focus areas. But then we also sort of stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to LLMs, for example. I read this morning that GPT-4 probably cost about $100 million just to train. We don't have those resources. We don't, now that it's built, there's not much point doing it again just so that we had something that was slightly different. Instead, where we see it, us being able to add value on top of these sort of systems, is then also at the bottom on that deep specialist knowledge of our domain and how we adapt big technology, so the big tech models for our domain. So with healthcare especially, the big problem here is about how do you create guardrails for LLMs, but also how do you create good user experiences for end users and so on. So I kind of say it's like 3 separate moats that we need to focus on. And I think these moats, these differentiators actually apply to every single AI company in the world. 1, you need to have a differentiator at the application level. For us, that is that we are deeply integrated into a healthcare, or into our customers' entire technical stack, from the infrastructure level with their call recording, from a platform level of all their data is in our database, through to an end user experience workflow perspective. We cover each of those. We're deeply integrated into our customers. 2, data. We have unrivaled data access when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to 911, nurse advice. And we focus a lot on how we can grow that data. So it's millions of consultations, thousands of conditions. And of course, it's not just the audio, it's the unstructured, it's the structured data on top of it, the label of, alongside the audio recording, what was it that the nurse actually thought that was wrong with the patient? What did they actually do with the patient? Sometimes, sadly not often, but sometimes we also have data on what then happened to the patient in the next step in their journey. When they went to hospital and they're seen by a specialist, was it the right decision the nurse made? We can use that as well to sort of, and that sort of data is really, really important for a company like us and for building specialist models. And then the final thing is, of course, the modeling, right? As I mentioned, we have researchers that are building new approaches to modeling, and that is a proprietary speech recognition. It's the suggestions engines that recommend the right things for clinicians to do. And it's also the models that can extract data from those unstructured things. So medical coding, for example, finding the patient details or the symptoms from a consultation. So that's the final slide. The other thing I wanted to just cover is, this is Corti, I've seen already, but we are also always hiring. So look at jobs.corti.ai. There's a lot of data science roles, engineering roles, product roles we're also looking for as well. And if you don't see something that necessarily fits, that doesn't mean it's not a good fit. We also take sort of unsolicited applications as well. We love getting talent in, people that know what they're doing and are excited for a mission like ours of helping healthcare. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Henrik. That was amazing. Do we have any questions in the audience today?
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting. I was wondering, you were one of the first AI startups that I heard about, and now everybody's talking about AI, and the tools are becoming incredibly accessible, and new tools are coming out every day. How has this tremendous technology development changed your company and what you need to do and the competitor landscape?
Really, really good question. Competitive landscape is on the surface, feels crazy. And every startup every Silicon Valley bro in the last sort of like 4 months has used ChatGPT to make our product. In fact, we're doing a hackathon this week with the engineers, and some of them have replicated some of the features we built just using GPT-4, and it's mind blowing. But that's also where the differentiators are really, really key, right? These models are great for prototyping things, but for some of the things we're doing, they aren't quite ready yet. I think that's maybe just a matter of time. I don't think that in itself is necessarily a core differentiator. But really, I think there are two places where we differentiate from a product perspective. One, we're doing it in real time. A lot of these startups are kind of doing it, there's documentation after the fact. By having that real-time representation of the consultation, we can actually drive the outcome of the consultation. We can make suggestions that actually change what a clinician was going to do. And to my knowledge, I don't think there are a lot of organizations startups that are doing that. The other thing is also just about our experience with healthcare. Our work is actually less about building technologies now. It's about dealing with super ancient computer systems and awful workflows and figuring out where the hell we sit in this. And that's what we're experts in now as well. And some guy from Silicon Valley that's put up a landing page and an API to ChatGPT is great, but that's not something that's easy to copy from Corti as well. So yeah, what you learn when you work with healthcare is it looks very sexy from the outside. There's a lot of legacy systems that you need to deal with for our customers.
Do we have more questions? We do.
You mentioned that a lot of the diagnoses from the doctors are not correct.
Yep.
And you're doing supervised learning, right? So you're basing your models on tainted results. So do you also aim at getting better than the current doctors? Because then you have to go in and weed out all that bad data, those bad conclusions.
It's a really, really good question. So we also need to be very careful, because when you start weeding out bad data, what is bad data? Do we know what bad data is? And then you start introducing bias into the data set as well. So what you often see with the errors in the clinical documentation, for example, is that it's not the same errors throughout, right? There are a couple of sort of systemic issues, and those problems at a system level, the model will learn. But the model also generalizes, sort of like averages out almost all of the errors. So it actually it helps to be better. It helps it to have a slightly better predictive ability from the doctors themselves. But this is also not what we're trying to do either. We're also not trying to replace the doctor. We're not trying to always be better, but it's about acting as a safety net or a second opinion that goes, I thought it was this. Have you thought about doing something else? Right? So you don't need to be better than the doctor for our use case. You just need to be a different approach to solving the same problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else with a question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation. You were very much in the Danish market and the US market, right?
And Sweden.
In Sweden, okay. So I was just thinking about, there might also be like a cultural aspects when people are talking about systems and what they talk about, that there could be a difference whether you are in Europe, US, or in other places on the continent.
Yes. So, well, firstly, there's language. Language is a big difference, obviously, but in also how we use language, how we describe things. So right now we're taking the approach of each language is distinct, and therefore the approach we take is distinct. We've done some experiments with looking across languages, though. Or actually, maybe a better example is across the same language, but from the US and Australia. And our speech recognition A was able to generalize, trained on US data, but able to generalize very well on Australian data. So that's the first thing. But what we also learned is that there isn't that much of a difference in how patients actually describe. So this was on 911 calls, and it's a little bit narrower domain than if you go to a GP. But the types of situations weren't significantly different. The ways that it was described weren't significantly different when it got to the pertinent parts of the consultation. So when it comes to 911 calls, it's about, is the patient breathing? Are they conscious? Those sorts of questions. And people typically answer those in the same types of ways, regardless of culture, I guess. But I think it definitely requires more investigation, yeah. And it's not something we've worked on heavily.
Do we have more questions in the room? Anyone online? No? So I'm curious about when you give recommendations to the doctors, healthcare professionals, do they tend to go with those recommendations? And if so, who would be liable for the choices that are made? I'm imagining in the US that would be quite a can of worms potentially.
Yeah, so from a liability perspective, we only ever suggest things. We ask them to sort of consider an alternative option, if you will. And we've actually worked with sort of regulators there to figure out what is the right way to present this as well. But how I like to see the product when it comes to the suggestions is kind of like a GPS, right? You, when you're in your hometown, you might put the GPS on just because it's easier, but for the most part, if it tells you to turn left and you know, there's roadworks down there, you know it better, so you're going to override the GPS. And what the GPS does is it does a little bit of recalculating, and then it figures out, actually, fine, your route is faster. But if you're in a foreign country, a new city, you're going to follow that GPS blindly. Not blindly, maybe that's the wrong word, but you're going to follow it more closely because you don't want to end up going down the wrong way in a one-way street. And so the equivalent when it comes to healthcare is if you are, so we work with nurses and nurse advice lines, their background might be in pediatrics, and suddenly the patient comes in, and because it's a nurse advice line, anyone can call in. They're suddenly not experts in whatever this new problem is because their background is pediatrics. They maybe need some more assistance with asking the appropriate questions. And I think that's kind of where, like, how I see our technology is a GPS that we're not driving for you, but we're giving you those hints to help make you go the right direction. And you're welcome to override them if you are confident enough to do so.
Thank you very, very much. There is a follow-up question. Sometimes it inspires more.
So I remember when you first came out as a startup, and yeah, I actually know Andreas as well, and had the initial discussions with him. But the thing that you sort of played on when you wanted to get an access and get out was that you were able to predict cardiac arrests with 90%. And it was only like a 1-1-2 kind of exercise.
Yep.
But hearing your pitch today, I was like kind of wondering, because that's maybe 5-7. I mean, it was just when Corti ideas started, right? So it's been some years, and your pitch is like another sort of beachhead kind of thing, or at least another approach. Seems that you're going for, like a broader audience or broader customer base. Is that because of scalability, or was it because it was too difficult to get into the 1-1-2 stuff, or how come you have changed your pitch to being actually a guided learning thing for all kinds of doctors?
Yeah, really, really good question. So, firstly, 112, 911 agencies, or 911 US, they are our biggest customer still, and that's been our focus for, as you said, the last 7 years, right? And what we learned is a couple of things. Firstly, the cardiac arrest alerts on their own. So we could detect these cardiac arrest alerts and we show it pop up on the screen, and we do it accurately and typically faster than the call taker. That on its own doesn't help to drive enough of... it's almost too late by that point. What we really realized is that the cases where a cardiac arrest was missed was actually because the underlying protocol itself was either not followed or was suboptimal for the situation. So we then started building tools to analyze the protocol, the questions that they ask, and then from there we suddenly realized that actually this is now a problem that also exists in nurse advice lines. They have protocols or scripts, or if they don't have one that's sort of written down, they at least have some sort of implicit script that they follow based on their training. And we kind of fell into more and more customers that at a high level had exactly the same problem. So that's from a market perspective why we sort of expanded. And then from a business perspective, 112 and 911 agencies are government funded, and we are also a business. So the opportunities they were definitely there. They're just a lot slower and less revenue, I guess. Yeah. Awesome.
We don't have time for any more questions, unfortunately. I would like to switch this one over. Let's see if we can succeed this time around. Let's give Henrik a big, warm thank you.
Thank you.
So we almost have a tradition here in Applied AI and Lunch Talks to hear from companies that have to do with health tech or using AI for increasing the quality control of production. Next time we're going to hear about how it can be useful in terms of strategy development. So we're going to hear from Cecilia Amalie Andersen, who's from Track Unit, and she's going to come and share more about the perspectives of using AI when it comes to strategy. So please stay tuned. Join us on May 11th. It's going to be 12:10 again. Thank you so much for this time.